Man, it's great to turn in the Word after hearing the Word sung, the gospel proclaimed in song. Now to turn to Luke chapter 16, where we've been studying. We've heard the words of Jesus. He's on the journey to Jerusalem. There is this pursuit. He has set his face like a flint toward Jerusalem, and he knows what is coming along the way. He continues to encounter the Pharisees. The tension between him and the Pharisees is amping up and growing along the way. And so we get to Luke 15. He is accused of receiving sinners and eating with them. And he tells one parable, three stories. The third story in that set of parables is what we call the prodigal son. I told you it's better known as the compassionate father with two disobedient sons. But then in Luke 16, we have two parables. There's the parable of the unjust steward, the dishonest manager he is sometimes called. And then Jesus has an encounter with the Pharisees. He talks to them about money, their view of the law, about divorce and adultery, because they've made it about them. And then immediately after dropping that out there, exposing their heart, because it says they're lovers of silver. These Pharisees love money. They're lovers of silver. They even treat marriage the same way they treat the law. It's about them. And if they hurt their wives along the way, they discard them as though they were disposable and dispensable and pick up another one, all under the guise of keeping the law, because they get what was a legal divorce, and then they get a legal marriage. And though they are in no way one flesh, they have the protection of the law, even though God is displeased with what they do. And now Jesus immediately launches into another story. It has thematic connections to the previous two that he's told. See if you can pick them out while we read, beginning in verse 19 of Luke chapter 16. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. But even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. Besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us." And he said, "Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment." But Abraham said, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them." And he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead." Now, typically, as I preach a sermon, you have notes and there are blanks that you fill in as I go through it, and I'm going to get there, but I want you to know I'm not getting to those blanks for a long time. all that is coming sort of at the end. I just want you to think with me through the story. And again, what Luke is doing, ultimately what Jesus is doing. Because not only did Jesus speak it, but Jesus, through the Holy Spirit, is the author of all the Bible. And he's put this gospel together in such a way that it is unfolding certain truths, not only about Jesus and about the gospel, but ultimately about us. Now remember, Jesus has been teaching that your view of money will shape your view of other things, your view of the law, your view of marriage, of life itself. That's what we've seen in these previous weeks. In other words, if you see life as about you, then pleasure and comfort are always the goal. And if it's about something bigger than you, the God who created you, then you're going to use your money, you're going to use your marriage, you're going to use your obedience to God to bless others and to glorify Christ. We read this story, and it is, at first, it's not that unique. In fact, you can go in all kinds of Middle Eastern cultures, and you can find a similar story about a rich man and a poor man, and then they go through death, and on the other side of death, their roles are reversed. They're sort of what we call pearly gates stories, that there's some judgment on the other side of death that says, no, you don't get to come in here, and no, you're welcome. You suffered in the world, and now you're welcome in heaven, and you had good things, but you didn't use them for others, and now you're barred from heaven. And you can find stories like that in a lot of cultures, because deep in our hearts, all of us have a sense of the need for justice. We look around us, we see lots of injustice. We want to believe that there's a time when all the wrongs are going to be righted and things are going to be made straight. In fact, isn't that sort of the promise of the Old Testament, that every mountain shall be made low, every valley shall be exalted, the crooked shall be made straight, the rough places plain, and that's what we long for. So it's not that unusual that Jesus would tell a story like this, but it's the second part of this story that is completely unique in all cultures and in all literature. Jesus does something about the other side of death that you just simply don't find anywhere else. Those stories typically offer some kind of a political commentary on life's ambiguities and disparities. And Jesus is commenting on that, right? He has warned us that we should use what he calls our unrighteous money to do what? To make friends that will receive us into everlasting habitations, into eternal dwellings. And he told the story of the dishonest manager who did exactly that. Remember, he called his master's debtors. He said, cut that bill. And what was he doing? He was using money to make friends that would receive him in the future because he was going to be out of a job. And Jesus said, the sons of this world are smarter, they're wiser with the way they use money for the future than the children of light. Because the children of light seem to go through life without even realizing that I need to use what God has given me here and now to establish a future in the there and then, in the eternal dwellings that I'll be going to. Now, this is a story Jesus tells in keeping with that one that we read in the first part of chapter 16, because this is a story about a guy who has money, but he fails to use it to make eternal friends who will receive him into those dwellings. And Jesus is telling us that money is always pressing to master you. Either you master your money, your possessions, the blessings of life, and you use them intentionally for the glory of the Lord, or if you do not, they will master you. They will press for your allegiance. They will become your God. And the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, had fallen into that trap. Here they were recipients. They were descendants of Abraham, recipients of God's grace through his word. They had access to the law of Moses and the prophets. And yet, with all of this blessing and benefit, they still fell prey to the trap of greed. And they used the law that God had given to point them to his redemption instead for self-justification. So Jesus he's hammering on them. And he tells this story. It's the third in a trilogy. And the prodigal wastes his father's possessions. The unjust steward wastes his master's possessions. But now in this story, you have the rich man wasting his own possessions. Now how does Jesus tell the story? By the way, the economy of words that Jesus uses is just astounding. There's so much here in really very, very few words. And Jesus tells us so much about the rich man, so much about Lazarus, with just little clues dropped in here and there. For instance, we know the rich man does not observe the Sabbath. How do we know that? Well, it says that the rich man dressed himself every day in purple robes and fine linen, and he fared sumptuously. He had a big meal prepared for him every day. Now, if he's an observant Jew, you can't do that on the Sabbath, right? But this guy does it every day. And when Jesus tells us that he wears purple, that's a very, very expensive dye. It comes from a particular creature that is hard to get and harvest, and purple was the royal color. Only the richest people ever wore purple, and this guy wears it every day, not just sometime, but every day. And even there's a little bit of humor here. He wears fine linen. This is cotton, and this would have been used for his undergarments. Jesus is saying the guy is dressed in purple on the outside. Underneath it all, he's wearing even linen undergarments. This guy spares no expense for his own comfort and to make sure that he's using his wealth for himself. Exactly what Jesus has said not to do. But at his gate, there was laid. Now, did you notice that little detail? This tells us that Lazarus can't walk. He has to be laid at the gate. That somebody in the community has to pick him up and carry him there to the gate of the rich man. And they know that on the other side of that gate, by the way, let's notice that he's got a gate. There aren't many people in these little towns and villages in Israel that have a gate. These houses are built abutting one another and right jutting up against one another. Nobody has a yard with a gate. This guy's got a gate. And they bring Lazarus to the gate every day because they know that on the other side of that gate there is a man who's making certain that a big meal is prepared for him, and his friends are coming and reclining at the table with him to fare sumptuously, the text says. They're eating at this meal every single day. And Lazarus can sit on the other side of the gate and he can smell the lamb roasting. He can get a whiff of the vegetables and the bread baking in the oven. He can smell it all. He can hear their laughter and their conversation. And he is hungry. It says he desired to just, if he could just be filled with the crumbs, if he could just be filled with whatever falls off the table. You know, they would eat with their hands, and they would use this hard-baked bread basically to wipe their hands off, let it soak up the oils and the solids, and then they would toss the bread under the table to be picked up by the servants later. Lazarus would have been content just to have that. By the way, Luke uses this word desired in a very special way. It means to want something that you don't ultimately get, you can't have. Remember, he used it for the prodigal. when the prodigal took the job feeding the pigs, that said he desired to what? To fill his belly with the husk that he fed the pigs, but he can't digest them. He desired it, but he couldn't do it. And here's Lazarus, same word. He desired to be filled with whatever fell off the rich man's table, but he couldn't do it. Lazarus is sick. He's unable to walk. He is covered with sores. He is starving. While only a few feet away, a group of overfed men recline every day while he lays out there hungry and in pain. Help is always near at hand, but it's withheld from him. Now, in the English translation, if you're using the ESV like I do, it says moreover. I think the King James uses that word, moreover, the dogs. But in Greek, literally, it says, I don't know why they struggle with translating this, because it's just a good old ordinary word for but. But even the dogs licked his sores. Now, I want you to understand, this doesn't certainly sound appealing to us in any way, but the point that Jesus is making is that that's the only relief that Lazarus gets. That the dogs licking his sores provides a type of relief. And in fact, in the ancient Near East, not so much the Jews, but all the peoples around them, they used dogs for healing. They somehow figured out that dogs licking sores would make them heal faster, and there were places you could go. We've discovered a place in Ashkelon, just north of Israel, with 1,500 dog carcasses buried very specifically in one of these healing places. So these people would have known that the dogs licking on a sore is not an insulting thing. It's a healing thing in a sense. What Jesus is saying, we don't know, are these street dogs? Well, they're not threatened by Lazarus because he has no food to fight with them over that food. Are they guard dogs? Jews were not allowed to have dogs as pets, but they were allowed to have them as guard dogs if they kept them on a chain. And if these dogs belonged to the rich man, they long ago figured out Lazarus is no threat. He can't walk. He can't do anything. And Jesus is making the point that these dogs are the only contact, the only touch, the only source of any kind of comfort or healing that Lazarus gets. The rich man, he's wearing purple and fine linen and eating a full meal every day. He fares sumptuously. Lazarus, sick, in pain, covered with sores. The rich man does nothing for him, but the dogs, they lick his sores. They have more compassion for Lazarus than the rich man. Jesus is making the point that they're not joining the rich man in tormenting Lazarus. Lazarus is no threat to the dogs. It's a hint, if you will, at Lazarus' gentle soul. There is absolutely nothing threatening about him. Now see these two men. One clothed in purple and fine linen, the other is naked and covered with sores. One luxuriated every day with a banquet, while the other one longs for scraps of bread that fall from the table. One had many servants to satisfy all his needs, and the other one had no servants other than the dogs who licked his sores. And then they died. And then they died. May I say, this is not the point of the parable, but it should not be lost on us that whatever goes before that sentence in your life, that sentence will come. Whatever you achieve, whatever you own, whatever you accomplish, one day someone might talk about it, but then they will note, you died. You died. Whatever great preacher or teacher or politician or business owner or husband or wife or parent or grandparent you may be. And all those things are laudable. We want those things, don't we? Those are good things. But you're going to die. And Jesus is making this point that whatever God has given you, you better use it to make friends who are going to receive you into eternal habitations, right? Lazarus is too poor for a funeral. Notice it says they buried the rich man, but Lazarus just died. And the one who was laid, others had to carry him to lay him at the gate, is now escorted by angels right into the great banquet where he is seated, not just anywhere. He's seated right beside Father Abraham, father of the Jews, father of faith, great hero of the Old Testament, and Lazarus gets the seat of honor right beside him. The rich man died, was buried, and to no one's amazement, he finds himself in the torments of Hades. And Jesus says that he lifts up his eyes and he can see afar off. Now, understand, this is not given to us as a source of understanding everything about what we would call personal eschatology, a fancy way of saying, what is it like on the other side of death? I don't know. This tells us some things. It doesn't tell us everything. But Jesus is not trying to teach us everything about the other side of death. He's telling us about being prepared for it. And he tells us that the rich man can see afar off and he can communicate. He sees Father Abraham there. Remember, Jesus has told us about the great banquet, right? And he has warned us that not everybody that we think is going to be at that banquet is going to be there. In fact, some that rejected the invitation here aren't going to be there. And who did he say to invite? The poor, the blind, the lame, right? He said, go out into the highways and hedges and compel them to come in that my house may be full. Now, Jesus is giving us a glimpse of exactly that. There's Abraham. Abraham, the father of faith, who left everything and followed God to go to a country he didn't even know where it was. And here he is in the kingdom, seated at the table, the place of honor, Lazarus right beside him. The rich man sees him afar off and he calls out. It says that he saw Abraham, and then Jesus puts this little detail in there, and Lazarus seated at his side. Lazarus is right there leaning against Abraham's bosom at this three-sided table called a triclinium. Wow. And now the fact that the rich man recognizes Lazarus and knows his name tells you something. That every day he knew who was outside his gate. He knew the need of Lazarus. And he calls out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Wow, this is interesting, by the way. I've been in the Middle East many times. And in Brazil a lot. And beggars in Brazil will call me, they'll holler at you, patron, which means it's from this Greek word translated father. It means boss man, or hey boss. And they'll say, have mercy on me. Have mercy on me. I've been in the Middle East. Have mercy on me. This is exactly what the rich man says. He's using the language of beggars. Elees on me. Have mercy on me, Father. Have mercy on me. He's using the language of a beggar because now he's the supplicant. And he says, why don't you send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue? Now look, this is unexpected. What would you think he would do? Here's a rich man. He's in the torment of hell, and he sees the guy that he passed by every day, the guy whom he would not even allow him to eat the crumbs from his table. He sees him seated at the side of Abraham. What do you think he would do? I think when Jesus said this, his audience must have been electrified. Oh, he'll apologize. He'll say, oh, I am so sorry. I now see that what I did in life was wrong. There's none of that. What's he do? He shows that his character in hell is no different than it was on earth. Father Abraham, now that Lazarus is up on his feet and can walk, give him a job to do for me. I'm tormented in this flame. So send Lazarus to dip his finger in water and come and cool my tongue. Now, he doesn't address Lazarus. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't admit how wrong he was. He's got a job for him to do. When Lazarus was in pain, he was ignored by the rich man. And now the rich man is in pain, and something must be done about it immediately by Lazarus, by the guy that he ignored his whole life. Instead of an apology, he demands services. And from the very man he refused to help in spite of his great wealth, he might as well have said, hey, given who I am and given who he is, service is expected. Send that guy beside you to come and cool my tongue, because I'm not accustomed to discomfort. See, he sees Lazarus with his eyes. Jesus says he lifts up his eyes and sees, but he does not see Lazarus with his heart, even now, even from hell itself. He could have at least had the good sense to pretend to be sorry and to show humility. He wants his suffering to stop, or at the very least to be reduced, but he does not want his character to be changed because he still thinks it's fine. I want you to get this. There are people out there who are preaching that, God is gracious and merciful, and after death, there'll be a post-mortem offer of salvation. I want you to see there is no such thing. That one of the points Jesus is making here is that without the grace of God, what you are on earth is exactly what you will be in hell. It will be hardened. It will be fixed. You will have neither desire nor opportunity to change who you are in hell. There'll be a desire for relief from suffering. He clearly wants relief from suffering, but what he does not want is a change of his own heart and his own disposition. Now, those listening to Jesus tell this story will be absolutely engrossed in what he's saying. The tables are turned. Lazarus, in a position of great power, reclining beside the greatest Jew who ever lived, Abraham himself. The rich man, unchanged, still demanding service. And what does Lazarus say? Well, what do you think Lazarus would say? What do you expect Lazarus to say? I don't know about you, but I expect Lazarus to sort of be enraged. Where were you when I needed help? But Lazarus is quiet. He never speaks in the first part of the parable, nor in the second. This gentle, long-suffering man has no reservoir of anger ready to explode, no reflections of retaliation, no score he has to settle, no vengeance to exact. Lazarus is as silent inside the gates of heaven as he was outside the gates of the rich man. And Jesus is telling us something about Lazarus' character. Lazarus creates meaning by what he chooses not to say and not to do. But the rich man, he's showing us exactly who he is. Tell Lazarus, let Lazarus dip his finger in water and come and cool my tongue. I'm tormented in this flame. Now, how will Abraham respond to this insensitive request? I love the word Jesus has him uses. He says, teknon, my boy, my son. This is not the generic word for son. This is a word for an affectionate word for son. My dear boy. The same word the father used when he addressed the elder brother in the prodigal son story. Now, what is it that the rich man has claimed? When he calls Abraham father, what's he saying? Hey, I'm a Jew. Don't I get a pass? I'm a descendant of Abraham. Don't I get an automatic buy right into the pearly gates? And Abraham says, Teknon, hey, my son, my child. It's like Abraham saying, you may be my son, but you aren't God's. My dear boy, he doesn't deny that the rich man is at least distant family. But now he uses the clear classical cry of the prophets. When you read the prophets, you know one verb they use over and over and over? Remember. Remember that the Lord your God brought you up out of Egypt. Remember that the Lord has delivered you from the oppressor. And this is the word that Abraham uses. Remember, when you were alive, in fact, he says, remember 4 things. Number 1, you received good things. Number 2, Lazarus received bad things. Number 3, he is comforted. And number 4, you are in anguish. Now, these 4 statements exactly match the 4 scenes in the earthly life of the 2 men. You received good things. You dressed in purple and fine linen and feasted sumptuously every day. Lazarus, bad things. He was poor and covered with sores and had to be laid at the gate. He is now comforted. He was carried to Abraham's bosom. You are now in anguish. And being in Hades, he lifted up his eyes, being in torment. Abraham is restating what the first part of the parable already told us. But when he says this word receive, you received good things. Now that word is pregnant with meaning. He doesn't say you earned good things. He doesn't say you deserved good things. He's reminding him that everything he had in life was a gift. Paul puts it like this: what do you have that you have not received? You think you earned that degree that hangs on your wall? You think you deserve that job you have? You believe that somehow God owes it to you to let you have that next breath you draw? Everything you have, you received. And he reminds him, when you were alive, you received all kinds of good stuff. Everything was a gift. You received them at God's hand. Notice, Lazarus is not described. When Abraham describes Lazarus, he doesn't say, and now Lazarus is healed, as though his greatest need was physical. Nor does he say, and now Lazarus is fed, as though his biggest need was food. He says he's comforted, revealing to us that really Lazarus' deepest need was his psychic pain. Folks, we are surrounded by thousands of people every day of our lives who are in such anguish and hurt. And maybe they're poor, maybe they're hungry, maybe they're oppressed in many, many ways, but their deepest need is the psychic pain of being alienated from other people, alienated from God, treated like they have no value, no worth, no one loves them. Abraham says, now he's comforted and you are in anguish. Besides this, there has been fixed. Boy, that's a definite word. This isn't a temporary thing. There's been fixed a great chasm. Only time that word's used in the New Testament, but we all know what it means, and it's exactly that word from Greek, chasm. There's a great chasm between you and us, so that anyone who would go to you from here may not be able. Now, can I just stop and say, who on earth would be willing to go to the rich man from heaven? Again, Jesus is hinting to us something about the character of Lazarus. It might be that Lazarus would be willing to show grace and mercy to the one who never showed it to him. But Abraham shuts that off. He says, no one from here can go there, and no one from there can come to us. Instead of remembering the good things he had, the rich man's attentions now turn elsewhere. Abraham has told him, your suffering can't be assuaged. You can't be comforted. So now his attentions go back to earth, back to his father's house, back to his 5 brothers. And once again, the rich man becomes the beggar. Well, then send Lazarus. How easy it is for him to say what Lazarus ought to do. Still, even in the torment of hell, feeling somehow entitled as though Lazarus should be at his beck and call. If Lazarus can't be used as a waiter to bring water, perhaps he can be used as a courier to take a message. Once again, no hint of repentance or apology. This rich man's class-structured world is still intact. And he says, let Lazarus go and tell my brothers. And Abraham says, no, let them hear Moses and the prophets. He says, oh no. If someone would rise from the dead, boy, they'd hear them. They'd hear them. And Abraham says what is really the point of the story. He says, if they won't hear Moses and the prophets, they won't hear even though one should rise from the dead. Now, by the way, John's gospel proves this very thing. In John chapter 11, Jesus raises another guy named what? Lazarus. He raises him from the dead. And the chief priest, do they repent? And they say, well, this is obvious. This means Jesus is the Son of God. He's the Messiah. I want to fall down at his feet and worship him. No. They say, we got to kill him. We've got to kill him. Now, let's take a look now. What is Jesus teaching us? This parable teaches us, first of all, the reality of injustice in life. We live in a world that is unjust, and there is inequity, and it is broken. It is not of our merit or goodness that caused us to be born in a land of freedom, or in a family with 2 parents, or to be given educational opportunities. Whatever you have, it's the grace of God. And you have no right to look at someone else and feel like you're better than them. Injustice is real in this world. Some suffer while others live sumptuously. Some are in rags, others in riches. Some hunger, others hoard. And how anybody can read this and not see the one obvious truth here that Jesus is teaching us, and that is that I must care for the poor and the downtrodden. It disturbs me today that there's a backlash against the basics of the Christian faith. That people are like, oh, you can't talk about social justice. Man, can you read the Gospel of Luke and think Jesus doesn't care about the poor? I don't know what Bible some people are reading. Jesus cares about the injustice of life, and he's clearly teaching us to use whatever resources we have to bless others and to glorify God. It's not about us, it's about him. And the second thing he's teaching us here in this parable is the reversal of status and death. I had Brother Chris read Mary's song of praise called the Magnificat earlier. And if you were listening when he read it, a major theme in Mary's song of praise in Luke chapter 1 is the reversal, that those that are lowly are being exalted, and those that are kings and sit on thrones are being debased. And what is the passage Jesus reads on the very first day of his public ministry? He goes to the synagogue at Nazareth. He opens the Isaiah scroll right to the passage, it says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. And if you don't care about the poor and the captives and the blind and the oppressed, then you don't line up with Jesus. The gospel elevates the lowly. It debases the proud. It levels the ground. Every valley shall be exalted. Every mountain shall be made low. And the ground at the foot of the cross is completely level. You have no more access to it than anyone else, and you are not restricted to the cross because of what you don't have in this world. Eternity is going to look very different from the now. Now there are the haves and the have-nots. There are the rich and the poor. There are the powerful and the weak. But in eternity, nobody's going to be bragging on their pedigree or their possessions. Jesus is warning us about this. The takeaway here is that I must live for eternity. He's been telling us this. You've got to use what you have to lay up treasure in heaven, to bless others who will receive you into eternal habitations. But this parable also teaches the reality of hell for sinners. Jesus talks about hell more than any other person in the Bible. And it's a major theme of Jesus. To deny hell is the same thing as denying Jesus' concern for the poor and the downtrodden. Jesus talked about both things. And if you're going to line up with Jesus, you're going to have to believe in caring for people less fortunate than you, and you're going to have to believe in the reality of hell. And what this means is I cannot trust in my birth, in wealth, or even my religion to keep me out of hell. Here you have Jesus telling us that the rich man is going to say, Lord, Lord. The rich man is going to say, Father Abraham, look at this. I'm one of your descendants. And just like there are going to be some people who were nominal Christians who are going to say, Lord, Lord, didn't we do a lot of good stuff in your name? And he's going to say, depart from me, workers of iniquity. I never knew you. You can't trust in your good deeds. You can't trust that you were a member of the Buck Run Baptist Church. You can't trust in your wealth or birth or anything but Jesus. Also, this teaches us the relentlessness of torment in hell. Elsewhere, Jesus describes hell as a place where even a worm doesn't die. There's no relief from the suffering of hell, of separation from God. You remember in the story of the prodigal son that the father's love, the grace he showed both of his sons was relentless. He pursued the son. When he saw him afar off, he gathered up his robes and he ran to meet him. And he gave him a grace that would not be retracted. He takes him into the banquet hall and he kills the fatted calf and puts a ring on his finger. He brings in a symphony and they play music and there's dancing and they're throwing a party because the Father's grace is relentless. What Jesus is showing us here is that his justice is just as relentless as his grace. You are going to be pursued by the grace of God or by the justice of God. I will either experience the relentlessness of grace or of torment, one or the other. But God's will is not turned once we're on the other side of death. But this also tells us the role of Moses and the prophets. I want you to get this. Here's what Jesus is saying. You know what the rich man is asking for? He's asking for a big show. You know what? If if you would get Lazarus to come back from the dead, Lazarus show up at my father's house, the sore's gone, walking on his feet, a little bit of meat on his bones. Man, they'd see that and they would, and by the way, here's the first time the word's been used in any of these parables. They will repent. The rich man is the one who uses the word. Isn't that ironic? Here he is, even in hell, not repenting. Even in hell, solidified in his prejudice and his self-centeredness. And suddenly he's concerned about his brothers repenting. Oh, put on some big show. Abraham says, man, they have the Bible. They've got Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. Oh, no. By the way, what audacity to argue with Father Abraham. No, Father Abraham. No, that won't do. The Bible's not enough. And man, aren't there a lot of preachers today and churches today that they've bought into the rich man's philosophy? They're all about the show, but there's not much Bible. You put on some big display, you got the right lighting and the fog machines and I saw a video recently of a church down in Florida. I mean, they've got dancers. I mean, it's like a Broadway play. It's very, very impressive. There's just one thing missing, and it's the gospel. Oh, no. You can't just preach the gospel. No church is going to sit for 2 years while a preacher gets up and preaches in one book. Who's going to do that? You got to put on a show. You need some big display. Oh, man, if you can get somebody, raise them from the dead, heal somebody every now and then, do something. But the Bible's not enough. No, Father Abraham, send Lazarus. Oh, no. If they won't hear Moses and the prophets, they won't hear the one rose from the dead. See, I must accept the witness of the Scriptures. And the Scriptures point to Jesus. And Jesus is enough. Notice he says, if one rose from the dead, oh, they'd hear him. Abraham says, oh, if they don't hear Moses and the prophets, they won't hear the one rose from the dead. Now, what's Jesus doing? Jesus is telling us that there is a resurrection of one from the dead. But get this, folks. If I do not believe the Bible, I'm not going to believe in Jesus either. There are people today that are trying to get to Jesus without the Bible. A very well-known preacher down in Atlanta is saying we need to decouple ourselves from the Old Testament. We need to, quit. Modern people, they're not going to buy into the miracles of the Old Testament. All we need to do is preach the resurrection. I don't even know, I can't process that reasoning because it's totally contrary to what Jesus says and Abraham says, that you can't get to the resurrection except through Moses and the prophets. See, the Scriptures are sufficient to reveal Christ and to generate faith. What else do I have? See, Jesus didn't simply show up in this world with no context, no nothing. He just showed up and say, oh, I'm the Son of God, and if you believe in me, you can have everlasting life. No. You know what God did as a measure of his grace? For centuries prior to the coming of Christ, he told us he's coming. He told us what he's going to be like. He told us what he was going to accomplish. He told us how the world was going to receive him and reject him and crucify him. He describes it in great detail. He tells us where he's going to be born. He tells us what he's going to do. And so when Jesus comes, he can point back to Moses and the prophets and say, yeah, I'm the one they were talking about. Watch me. Observe me. See how my life fulfills exactly what was prophesied. And then he dies on Calvary's cross, just like the Old Testament says he would. Psalm 22:1, my God, why have you forsaken me? There on the cross, Jesus lays down his life like the sacrifice for sin, like the Passover lamb. He's fulfilling everything. All those shadows in the Old Testament were cast by the great sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And when Jesus dies on the cross, we see, and then he rises from the dead. Well, that should settle it, right? Here's one who rose from the dead. And what do? Let's lie and say they stole his body. Those cowards who were hiding because they were afraid, suddenly they found courage to steal his body. Let's say that. Let's try and talk about the Passover plot. Let's say that it's all made up, that the early church just conspired to elevate Jesus from a man to this mythic, godlike figure. And this guy named Paul, he was just a brilliant guy, but a liar from start to finish. And he wrote these beautiful books, but they're beautiful to read, but they all happen to be untrue. And can you imagine? I mean, Jesus rose from the dead, and yet the world doesn't believe him. He gave us many witnesses. He commanded his church to tell everyone this good news, that the promised one has come to offer salvation to anyone who would believe. Here's my question. One has risen from the dead. Have you repented? Have you repented? See, God has spoken through his word. And the word has pointed us to Christ. And Christ has fulfilled his word. He died on Calvary's cross. He rose from the dead. And that means I believe the one who rose because I believe the one who spoke through Moses and the prophets.